Now before I get to the topic of this video, I want to quickly address CyberConnect 2's recent announcement of a new game project. I'm just going to be completely blunt, I don't think this is a Naruto game, nor do I even think this is an anime game. It's probably going to be an original IP, and regardless of what it may be, I do hope it can be of something of interest. But let's go back to the topic of Storm. Now, in my most recent video, I lamented the fact that in general, there's not a ton of incentive to be creative with combos, even though the game does offer you a lot of avenues. I mean, even disregarding the knockdown stun and combos after grabs and jutsus, the game also has a pretty flexible character switch mechanic that I know you can pull off some creative stuff. But in general, you're probably not gonna see a lot of that in high level matches. Now, aside from all of the reasons I mentioned in this video as to why I don't see a lot of creativity in combos, there's also another big reason, which is the fact that in general, Storm doesn't have a ton of offensive options to begin with, and it's been this way since Storm 1. In fact, in some connections, the only area where I would say the offensive options were somewhat increased was with your items toolkit, because in the past, they were supply limited. But in this game, they do replenish after some time, which does allow you to use them more frequently during matches. But beyond that, even though Storm C is generally a little more oppressive than a lot of the other Storm games, for the most part, your current arsenal is more so repurposed than actually new. Even the second jutsu isn't necessarily adding more offensive options, it did come with a sacrifice, that being the tilt moves. But this is where I want to entertain a simple idea. I think tilts should return, but not exactly in the way they used to be. Well, actually, kind of. More on that in a minute. You see, by the time we got to Storm 4, tilt attacks were pretty versatile. Depending on the character, it could honestly be anything. I mean, Edo Minato was an infamous example of someone who used his flying Raijin jutsu marks to teleport into you whenever he wanted. But there was a time back in the early days of Storm 1 when tilt moves were largely pretty simple and multi-hit attacks. But what's interesting about them is that there are traces of what used to be the equivalent of tilt attacks back in the PS2 Ultimate Ninja games. You see, in the early Ultimate Ninja games, auto combos were largely pretty similar to what we have right now. You inputted 3 to 4 normals, you could then finish them off with either a side, down, or up combo. But early Ultimate Ninja had something extra that honestly saddens me that's been lost to time, and that is the fact that if you held one of the inputs in the D-pad, you could pull off a variety of combos. 2L allow you to do knockdown combos that were pretty good for guard breaks. 4L combos were typically for throws that were also pretty useful for breaking guards. 6L combos were usually traveling attacks that were pretty good for closing in distance, and up combos were mostly just for launching characters to the air. Not to mention there were additional equivalent options for air attacks. Now, I'm not someone who necessarily prefers the classic PS2 games over the Storm games. I mean, when it comes to the open world, yes, I will forever lament the fact that the open worlds have been steadily getting worse as the years go by. But in terms of the combat system, there are some aspects of PS2 Ultimate Ninja games that are kind of difficult to get behind and makes me kind of prefer Storm a bit more. But if I ever had a reason for liking the classics over the new ones, it's mainly the fact that the classic games give you way more offensive options. Now, look, I'm not asking for jutsu clashes to come back. In fact, that and rock, paper, scissors, I'm actually glad they're gone because I don't think they're pretty good mechanics in general. I'm not asking them to revive taunts or different awakening tiers. In fact, I'm even willing to accept only having one ultimate jutsu, even though back in the days when you had like 2 to 3 ultimate jutsus, that was really fucking cool. But regardless, I can even accept that compromise. But one thing I definitely would want Storm to have is more tilt combos. In fact, with Storm, I genuinely believe it will work out a lot better for 2 reasons. For one, the responsiveness and input latency is just way better in Storm than it was with the PS2 UN games, so it would be much easier to time your inputs. But additionally, with Storm connections having a much more liberating and flexible combo system, I truly do see a lot of ways this would result in characters having some great sauce. My suggestion would mainly be to have side tilts, down tilts, and up tilts. Honestly, with something like this, I wouldn't even bother advocating for heavy attacks like I used to back in the days, because while yes, I think that there would be an interesting replacement to what we currently have with weapons throws, but a lot of characters, with them having knockdown stuns in the middle of their auto combos, This would make it pretty possible to, instead of following up with a neutral, down, or up combo, you can convert it into a tilt combo by just simply delaying the next attack. Now obviously not every character has knockdown stuns. In fact, not every character necessarily even has viable stuns like adult Sasuke's universal pull. In fact, speaking of Sasuke, I was recently exploring some of his Shippuden variants, and I noticed that while Taka Sasuke does actually have a crumble in his normals, with Heavy Sasuke I couldn't find any, but of course with how cancelable a lot of attacks are in this game, I'm sure there are probably ways to utilize them during combos even with less flexible characters. Now, there's this Storm Connections mod that I recently installed called Reconnections. Now, I'm just gonna tell you right now, I don't think I want to use this mod ever again. While I do appreciate the fact that they brought back a lot of lost content, including side combos, they also removed features from Storm C, like second jutsus, chakra dash after air knockdowns, and probably also second support skills because it didn't seem to work for me with any of my characters. So, from my perspective, if you're just gonna strip away features that make Storm C distinct from Storm 4, you might as well just play Storm 4 instead of this. I don't really see the point of reversing features, but regardless, that's just my opinion. This mod actually does allow me to try out exactly what I was talking about, where you can cancel your normals into tilts. Except imagine instead of one, we had 3 tilt moves based on where you're aiming the analog. I think it would be pretty cool and honestly legitimately would feel like new content. Because for the most part, a lot of the characters that had already been introduced in past Storm games don't really feel like new content. They also feel repurposed. But if they all had tilt moves in the way that I'm describing, this would honestly make them feel a lot more fresh, and honestly, at least in terms of the combat system, even if it doesn't end up offering as many offensive options as the PS2 Ultimate Ninja games, it would have caught up enough to the point where I feel like you'd be spoiled for quite some time. But anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm curious to hear what y'all have to say. The only thing about having 3 tilt moves that would maybe worry me a little bit is the question of whether or not the engine is able to recognize different directions when initiating the combo. But to be honest, this doesn't come across as something that would be super difficult to engineer. I mean, Kill la Kill If has something kind of similar to this, and the game is already capable of recognizing different directions during the standard auto combos, so I don't think it's impossible, but I don't know, maybe they would need to rework some things. Anyway, I think that's really all I have to share. Take care.